1 week, 1 question. Have you ever been so tired that you start questioning everything? Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly. Like when you're brushing your teeth at night and suddenly think, why am I even doing all this? That was me last week in the United States. One ordinary week. 7 days. But one question kept following me everywhere, like background noise in my head. Do we judge people too fast, because we're exhausted, or because we're afraid to slow down? You see, when people talk about moving to or living in America, they often talk about opportunity, freedom, big dreams. What they don't talk about is how mentally loud it can be. Bills, schedules, children's needs. A marriage that still needs attention even when both people are running on low battery. And somewhere in between all that, there's you, trying to practice English, trying to listen, read, speak, while your brain just wants silence. That's usually when people quit learning. Not because English is hard, but because life is loud. Last week, I noticed something uncomfortable about myself. I was becoming quicker to judge, faster to label, slower to listen. Someone speaks broken English. I finish their sentence in my head. Someone looks ordinary. I assume their story is ordinary too. It wasn't cruelty. It was fatigue. Psychology actually has a name for this. When your cognitive resources are drained, your brain switches to shortcuts. Stereotypes. Snap judgments. It's not that you're a bad person. It's that your brain is trying to save energy. But here's the quiet danger. Those shortcuts don't just affect how you see strangers. They affect how you see your partner, your kids, yourself. In my marriage, that week felt heavier than usual. No big fight. No dramatic argument. Just that familiar distance that creeps in when both people are tired, but still pretending they're fine. We talked, but we didn't really listen. I answered, but I didn't really hear. If you're learning English, you know this feeling well. You hear the words, but the meaning slips past you. That's why this channel exists. Not to teach perfect grammar, but to help you slow down enough to hear meaning again. That week, I started paying attention to how I practiced English. I noticed I was rushing, skipping simple sentences, avoiding slow listening because I thought I was above that level. But neuroscience says something interesting. Slow input isn't for beginners. It's for stressed brains. When you slow speech down, comprehension increases, anxiety drops, and memory improves. Your brain finally feels safe enough to learn. Life works the same way. I didn't know yet that one simple taxi ride, would turn this question into a lesson. At that moment, it was just a question. A quiet one. Why am I judging so fast? Why am I tired all the time? Why does everything feel heavier when I rush? Maybe you're watching this video because you feel something similar. You want to improve your English, but more than that, you want to feel capable again. You want proof that slow progress still counts. That listening carefully can change things. That a small moment can reset a heavy week. This is not a story about English only. It's a story about attention. About marriage under pressure. About learning to pause before judging. And yes, about a man I thought was just a taxi driver. But that comes later. For now, just sit with the question that followed me all week in America. Don't answer it yet. Just notice how it feels. Do you judge people too fast? Or are you just tired of rushing? A marriage under quiet pressure. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, like dust settling on furniture you use every day. You don't notice it at first. But after a while, everything feels heavier to touch. That was my marriage last week in the United States. Not broken. Not dramatic. Just tired. We were doing all the right things on the surface. Talking about schedules. Planning meals. Making sure the kids were okay. From the outside, it looked stable. But inside, something was off. Conversations felt shorter. Listening felt shallow. We responded to each other the way people respond to emails they've already half decided not to read carefully. Psychologists call this emotional bandwidth depletion. When your mental energy is low, you don't stop loving, you stop processing. You hear your partner's words, but your brain is already busy surviving the next hour. And when that happens, misunderstandings grow in the silence, not in the arguments. That week, my English practice started to mirror my marriage in an uncomfortable way. I noticed I was choosing fast content. Skipping slow stories. Avoiding simple listening exercises because they felt too basic. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. Slow things required presence, and presence required energy I felt I didn't have. In relationships, we do the same thing. We assume we already know what the other person means. We finish their sentences. We translate their emotions into shortcuts. She's just stressed. He's always tired. And just like that, we stop listening. Science backs this up. When we're under long-term stress, the brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for empathy, nuance, and patience, goes quiet. Meanwhile, the brain's threat system takes over. Efficiency replaces curiosity. Speed replaces depth. It's not personal. It's biological. But biology doesn't protect connection. Attention does. One night that week, after the kids were asleep, we sat in silence longer than usual. No phones. No agenda. Just that strange space, where you can either drift further apart, or finally slow down. It reminded me of listening to English without subtitles. Uncomfortable. Quiet. Vulnerable. You can't hide behind speed there. That's when I realized something important for anyone learning English, and for anyone trying to keep a relationship alive. Progress doesn't come from adding more. It comes from removing noise. When you slow your listening practice, your brain relaxes. When your brain relaxes, comprehension improves. When comprehension improves, confidence follows. The same pattern applies to love. When you slow down enough to really hear someone, defensiveness drops. Meaning shows up. That week wasn't about fixing anything. It was about noticing. Noticing how often I rushed. How often I judged. How often I assumed I already knew the ending of a sentence, whether in English or in marriage. I didn't know yet that this quiet pressure would make me unusually open a few days later. Open enough to listen to a stranger. Open enough not to rush to conclusions. Open enough to be surprised. At the time, it just felt like exhaustion. The kind that makes you crave silence, but keeps your mind loud. The kind that makes slow English feel strangely comforting. The kind that makes an ordinary taxi ride feel like just another task to get through. Or so I thought. Because sometimes, when life presses gently but constantly, it's preparing you to notice something you would normally miss. A ride I almost ignored. It was late. Not dramatically late, just late enough that your body wants to be home, not thinking, not deciding, not listening to anything new. That's usually when the brain goes into autopilot. You stop noticing details. You stop being curious. You just want to arrive. That night, I ordered a taxi without a second thought. Same app. Same routine. Same small talk expectations. Hi. How are you? Long day. The kind of conversation you don't really hear yourself having. If you're learning English, you know this zone well. You understand the words, but nothing sticks. Everything passes through. When the car arrived, I barely looked up. Middle-aged man. Plain jacket. Calm voice. Nothing that triggered interest. My brain quietly labeled him, just a driver. Efficient. Safe. Done. And that label instantly reduced my attention. This is how judgment works in real life. It's not loud. It's economical. The brain sees something familiar and says, I've seen this before. No need to investigate. From a neurological perspective, it makes sense. Novelty costs energy. And that week, energy was expensive. So I sat in the back seat, checked my phone, and prepared to mentally disappear for the ride. But then something small interrupted that plan. He spoke slowly. Not exaggerated slow. Not teaching slow. Just human slow. His English wasn't flashy. His sentences were simple. Clear. Almost careful. And without realizing it, my brain relaxed. Because slow language is predictable. And predictable language feels safe. You might not notice this consciously, but your nervous system does. Studies in applied linguistics show that slower speech reduces cognitive load, especially for adult learners under stress. Your brain stops bracing itself. It starts listening instead of defending. I answered him. Also slowly. Not because I was trying to practice, but because rushing suddenly felt unnecessary. We talked about small things. Traffic. Weather. How long I'd been in the US. Simple questions. Simple answers. The kind of English people underestimate. But something interesting happened. I understood everything. No guessing. No mental translation panic. Just understanding. And that's when I realized how rare that feeling had become. In my marriage, in my parenting, in my learning, I was always half listening. Always preparing the next response. That taxi ride was the first moment all week where I wasn't multitasking mentally. I was just there. Still, I didn't think much of him. And that's important. Because the story isn't about instant wisdom or dramatic insight. It's about how easily we miss meaning when we think we already know who someone is. At one point, he mentioned his kids. Just in passing. No emotion. No story. But the way he said it, measured, respectful, made me look up. Parents recognize that tone in each other. The tone of someone who has learned patience the hard way. I asked one more question than necessary. Then another. This is how real conversations begin. Not with curiosity, but with the absence of hurry. That ride lasted maybe 20 minutes. But mentally, it felt longer. Spacious. Quiet. Like listening to English at half speed and realizing you don't need to rush to understand life either. I still thought he was just a taxi driver. And that assumption made what came next hit much harder. He looked like just a driver. There's a strange comfort in thinking you already understand someone. Your brain relaxes. It stops scanning. It stops asking questions. That night, sitting in the back seat, I felt that comfort fully. He looked like just a driver. Ordinary clothes. No signals of importance. No urgency in his voice. began in my tired state, that felt safe. Psychology calls this thin slicing. We make fast judgments based on limited information, and most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. It's not arrogance. It's efficiency. Your brain wants to conserve energy, especially when you're emotionally worn down. The problem is, thin slicing works best when you don't care about depth. I caught myself doing it. I was listening, but not deeply. I responded politely, but I wasn't curious. The conversation stayed on the surface, because I assumed there was nothing underneath worth exploring. If you've ever practiced English while distracted, you know the feeling. You hear words, but you don't enter the conversation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I do this at home too. When your partner speaks in a tone you've heard 100 times, your brain finishes the sentence for them. When your child complains about something small, you label it as noise. When someone speaks slow English, you assume they have little to say. That assumption is rarely about them. It's about your own fatigue. Research in social cognition shows that people under stress rely more heavily on stereotypes and visual cues. When your mental resources are low, curiosity becomes a luxury. But curiosity is exactly what relationships and learning need to survive. As the car moved through quiet streets, I noticed how calm he was. No rush. No irritation. Even when traffic slowed, his breathing stayed steady. That's not common in city driving. It stood out, even if I didn't fully register why yet. He asked me about my family. Just one question. Simple. Do you have children? The kind of question that can end a conversation or open it completely. I answered without thinking much. Then, unexpectedly, I added more. Ages. School. A small frustration I'd been carrying all week. Why did I share that? Because his pace invited it. Slow speech signals safety. Your nervous system lowers its guard. This is why slow listening practice works so well for adult learners. It's not just about language. It's about trust. When the brain feels safe, it stops protecting and starts connecting. I still didn't see him as anything other than a driver. But something had shifted. Not in my opinion of him, yet, but in my awareness of myself. I realized how rarely I allow conversations to unfold naturally. How often I rush to conclusions just to save time. The irony is, rushing usually costs more time later. In misunderstandings. In missed meaning. In shallow learning. That night, I thought I was just being polite. But in reality, I was being slowly invited into a deeper conversation, one I would normally avoid. And I almost shut it down with a single assumption. What I didn't know was that my mental label, just a driver, was about to fall apart in the quietest, most unexpected way. Slow English, real connection. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic reveal. No sudden confession. Just a small moment where the conversation stopped feeling like background noise and started feeling present. He chose his words carefully. Not because his English was weak, but because his thinking was precise. Short sentences. Clear pauses. Almost no filler words. In language learning, this is called intentional speech. It's slower, but it carries more meaning per word. Without realizing it, I matched his pace. This is something linguists call speech convergence. When two people feel psychologically safe, their rhythms align. Their speed matches. Their tone softens. And suddenly, communication becomes less about performance and more about understanding. I felt that immediately. My shoulders dropped. My mind stopped racing ahead. I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I was just listening. If you've ever had that rare moment while learning English, when comprehension feels effortless, you know how powerful it is. It's not exciting. It's calming. We talked about parenting. Not advice. Just observations. How kids watch more than they listen. How silence can teach more than lectures. Simple ideas. But the way he spoke made them feel earned. He mentioned that he used to work very long hours. That he missed things he couldn't get back. His voice didn't carry regret, just clarity. The kind that comes after hard lessons. At that point, my brain still had him categorized as a driver with life experience. Nothing more. But my respect for him had quietly grown. And respect changes how we listen. There's research showing that when we respect the speaker, our auditory processing improves. We literally hear better. That's why learning English from real stories works so well. Meaning sharpens attention. The conversation drifted to work. I asked what he did before driving. He smiled a little before answering. Not proudly. Not defensively. Just neutrally. That pause mattered. People who need to impress don't pause like that. He said he had been involved in business for a long time. I didn't ask how big. I didn't need to. The calm in his voice said more than numbers ever could. And then he said something that stuck with me. Driving helps me think. That sentence sounds simple. But think about it. People who are struggling rarely choose slowness. People who are secure do. Slowness is not a lack of ambition. It's often the result of having nothing left to prove. That idea hit close to home. In my marriage, in my learning, in my daily life, I was rushing as if speed would fix uncertainty. But speed usually hides it. Slow English didn't just help me understand him. It helped me understand myself. By the time we reached my destination, the ride felt shorter than it should have. That's how you know you were present. Time contracts when attention expands. I still didn't know who he really was. But I was finally ready to find out. The moment everything shifted. The moment didn't arrive with fireworks. No dramatic pause. No movie-style reveal. It came the way most life-changing realizations do, quietly, almost politely, when your guard is already down. We had stopped at a red light. The kind that feels longer at night. I thanked him for the conversation, the way people do when they assume an ending is near. He nodded, then casually mentioned he was heading to meet his wife after this ride. I asked where she was waiting. He said the name of a place that didn't match the story my brain had written. A private residential building. Not flashy. Just exclusive in a way you only notice if you've lived in the US long enough. My brain hesitated. Just for a second. That hesitation was the crack. Curiosity slipped through. I asked a follow-up question. A small one. Harmless. Do you drive full-time? He smiled again. The same calm smile. Then he said, slowly, no. I drive when I want to think. That sentence landed differently this time. I waited. Didn't rush to fill the silence. Silence, by the way, is one of the most underrated tools in both conversation and language learning. When you don't rush, people reveal themselves naturally. He continued. He explained that years ago, he built and sold a company. Then another. Then invested quietly. He didn't use numbers. He didn't use titles. He didn't need to. The way he spoke told me this wasn't imagination or exaggeration. This was a man who had already finished proving himself. That's when it hit me. I hadn't been wrong because I lacked information. I had been wrong because I didn't think there was more information worth waiting for. Psychologists talk about something called confirmation bias. Once your brain decides who someone is, it filters everything to support that belief. I had labeled him a taxi driver, so every detail fit neatly into that box, until it didn't. My chest tightened, not with embarrassment, but with recognition. How many times had I done this before? With people. With opportunities. With my partner. With myself. In marriage, we often lock each other into old roles. You're always like this. You never change. And then we stop listening for growth. We stop noticing evolution. Learning English works the same way. Adults often say, I'm bad at listening. And then they filter every struggle through that belief. They miss progress, because it doesn't match their identity. The irony. The man who owned more than I could imagine, chose a role that made him invisible. And I, someone trying to learn, grow, connect, almost chose invisibility for him. He didn't seem offended. That's the other thing. People who are secure don't need your recognition. They're not waiting for validation. That calm I noticed earlier suddenly made sense. We pulled up to my destination. I thanked him again, but this time my voice carried something different. Respect mixed with humility. As I stepped out, he said one last thing, almost as an afterthought. People rush, because they think time is scarce. But understanding is what's rare. That sentence stayed with me all night. Because in one quiet taxi ride, I learned something deeper than vocabulary or pronunciation. I learned that slowing down doesn't make you smaller. It makes you accurate. And accuracy, whether in language, love, or life, changes everything. A billionaire who chose silence. After that ride, I kept replaying one detail in my mind, not his wealth, not the surprise, but his tone. There was no pride in it. No desire to be understood or admired. He didn't tell me who he was until the conversation naturally reached that place. And even then, he shared it the way someone shares the weather. Calm. Neutral. Almost irrelevant. That kind of calm doesn't come from money. It comes from resolution. In psychology, there's a concept called self-concept clarity. People with high clarity don't need external validation to feel stable. They don't rush to explain themselves. They don't correct your assumptions. They let you misunderstand them if it doesn't cost peace. That night, I realized how rare that is, and how far I was from it. I thought about my own week. About how reactive I had been. How small misunderstandings at home felt heavier than they should. How easily I felt misunderstood, unseen, unappreciated. And suddenly, the contrast hurt a little. Here was a man who had every reason to demand recognition, and yet chose invisibility. Why? Because silence protected what mattered. He told me, during those last minutes, that the loudest years of his life were also the loneliest. Always needed. Always urgent. Always expected to decide. He lost moments with his children not because he didn't love them, but because he believed presence could be postponed. That sentence stayed with me. I thought I had time. In marriage, that belief is dangerous. We postpone listening. We postpone repair. We postpone softness. We assume love is stable enough to wait, while everything else demands attention first. And then one day, we realize the distance didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, just like pressure. The same thing happens in learning English. People postpone slow practice. They chase advanced content. Fast speech. Native speed. They think slowness is something you outgrow. But research in adult learning shows the opposite. The more complex your life, the more your brain needs slow input to integrate meaning. Speed without clarity creates fatigue, not fluency. That man didn't drive to escape responsibility. He drove to reclaim agency. To choose when to speak. When to listen. When to be nobody. And I wondered when I had last allowed myself to be nobody. Not a parent solving problems. Not a partner holding things together. Not a learner trying to improve. Just present. That night, after I got home, I noticed how differently I spoke to my partner. Slower. Fewer words. Less explanation. More listening. It wasn't intentional. It was residual calm. Silence had followed me home. And here's the part that matters most. He didn't change my life by teaching me something new. He changed it by reminding me of something I already knew, but had forgotten under pressure. That rushing is often fear wearing productivity's mask. That judging is often exhaustion pretending to be certainty. That slow attention is not weakness, it's maturity. The billionaire chose silence because he could afford to. But I realized something uncomfortable and freeing at the same time. You don't need money to choose silence. You just need courage. Courage to slow your listening. Courage to let simple English be enough. Courage to stop proving and start understanding. And the real test of that courage was waiting for me in the next place I would apply it, not with strangers, but with the people I loved most. Love costs more than money. That quiet night stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No arguments. No emotional speeches. Just two tired people sitting in the same space, without trying to escape it. And I realized how rare that had become. In many marriages, especially when living in a fast-paced environment like the US, love slowly turns into logistics. Who picks up the kids? Who pays which bill? Who remembers what? You still care deeply, but your conversations start to sound like project updates. Efficient. Clear. Emotionally thin. Researchers call this relational autopilot. When routines take over, partners interact more as managers than as humans. It's not a failure of love. It's a failure of attention. That week, attention was exactly what we were both missing. I noticed how my partner spoke more slowly once I stopped rushing the silence. Longer pauses. Softer tone. And in those pauses, meaning surfaced. Not complaints, truth. The kind you don't share when you feel unheard. This is why slow English practice matters so much for adult learners. When speech slows down, the brain stops preparing for defense. Anxiety lowers. Working memory stabilizes. You don't just understand words, you absorb intention. Love works the same way. That night, I didn't try to solve anything. I didn't offer advice. I didn't optimize the future. I just stayed. And staying, it turns out, is one of the most expensive things you can give. Because staying costs ego. It costs urgency. It costs the illusion that you're always in control. The billionaire learned this too late for some moments. He told me, almost casually, that missing bedtime stories hurt more than losing deals. Because deals can be replaced. Moments can't. That sentence reshaped how I saw my own week. I had been rushing through English practice the same way I rushed through conversations at home. Skimming instead of sinking in. Chasing progress instead of presence. And just like in marriage, that approach left me technically functional, but emotionally disconnected. So that night, after we talked, I did something small. I listened to a short English story, slow, simple, almost childlike. No subtitles. No pressure to repeat. Just listening. And I noticed something surprising. My comprehension was better than usual. Not because the content was easier, but because my nervous system was calmer. Science supports this. When emotional stress decreases, language processing improves. Your brain doesn't separate life stress from learning stress. It processes them together. A calmer relationship literally helps you learn better. That realization felt hopeful. Because it meant progress didn't require more effort. It required less resistance. Love costs more than money, because it asks for the one thing success often steals: undivided attention. And attention, once fractured for too long, needs intentional slowness to heal. That night didn't magically fix my marriage. But it reminded me why we started. Why we chose each other before life got loud. Before speed felt necessary. And it reminded me that learning, real learning, doesn't happen when you rush to become someone better. It happens when you allow yourself to be present as you are. That understanding settled quietly in me. And it prepared me for the next realization, about how children change everything in ways adults rarely admit out loud. Children change every decision. Children don't announce when they change you. They just watch. And somehow, their watching rearranges your priorities without asking permission. The next morning, the house woke up before I did. Small footsteps. Soft voices. That familiar chaos that feels exhausting until you imagine it gone. As I made breakfast, I noticed how much quieter my mind felt compared to the week before. Not because problems disappeared, but because my attention had shifted. Children do that. They pull you out of abstraction and into immediacy. That taxi driver understood this deeply. When he spoke about his kids, his language changed. Fewer words. More pauses. Parents often communicate this way when the topic matters too much to decorate. Precision replaces performance. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called attentional inheritance. Children learn what deserves attention by watching what adults slow down for. Not what we say is important, what we actually pause for. That idea hit hard. I thought about how often I practiced English with half my attention while my kids were nearby. How often I nodded while they spoke, already planning the next task. Not neglect, just distraction. But distraction teaches its own lesson. That morning, I tried something different. When my child spoke, I matched their pace. I waited. I didn't correct. I didn't rush the story. And something subtle happened. They spoke longer. More confidently. That's not accidental. Studies show that children speak more fluently when adults don't interrupt their rhythm. Language grows where it feels safe. The billionaire had learned this late, but deeply. He told me he used to believe providing was enough. That love was proven through security. But children don't remember security, they remember presence. They remember who listened. And that's the part no one prepares you for. Success can accidentally teach your children to perform instead of connect. That realization made me rethink how I approached learning English too. I was performing fluency instead of building it. Avoiding slow practice, because it felt childish. But children learn language precisely, because they are allowed to be slow. Neuroscience confirms this. The brain learns best through repetition at comfortable speed. Stress disrupts consolidation. Calm accelerates it. That day, I practiced English the way children do, out loud, imperfectly, without apology. Short sentences. Clear pauses. And for the first time in weeks, it felt natural. Children change every decision, because they reveal what matters when no one is watching. They expose your habits, your pace, your priorities. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That week in America wasn't just about a surprising stranger. It was about recognizing how quickly life trains us to rush, and how quietly children invite us back to what matters. The question wasn't whether I had time. It was whether I was willing to slow down enough to use it well. Why we judge too fast. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Judgment isn't a personality trait. It's a symptom. A symptom of overload. That week, I wasn't judging because I believed I was better than anyone. I was judging because I felt behind. Behind in energy. Behind in patience. Behind in the version of myself I thought I should be by now. When the gap between expectation and reality grows too wide, the brain looks for something solid to stand on. Labels feel solid. Psychologists call this cognitive closure. When uncertainty becomes uncomfortable, we rush to conclusions just to feel grounded again. It's why tired people argue more. Why stressed couples misunderstand more. Why adult learners quit more often right before progress appears. Uncertainty is heavy. Judgment feels lighter. But lighter doesn't mean healthier. I noticed how this played out in small, everyday moments. Someone cuts me off in traffic. I assume intention. My partner sighs. I assume criticism. An English sentence sounds unfamiliar. I assume failure. In each case, my brain skipped curiosity and jumped straight to interpretation. That jump saved time. But it stole truth. In language learning, this is deadly. Adults often hear one unfamiliar word and decide the whole sentence is lost. They stop listening. But comprehension doesn't require perfection. It requires tolerance for not knowing yet. Children have this tolerance naturally. Adults lose it under pressure. That taxi ride worked because it restored my tolerance for ambiguity. I didn't understand everything immediately. And that was okay. My brain stayed open. And openness is where meaning accumulates. The same applies to marriage. When you don't understand your partner's tone, your story about it matters more than the tone itself. Judgment fills the gap faster than curiosity. But curiosity, though slower, keeps the relationship alive. Research in couples therapy shows that successful long-term partners ask more clarifying questions and make fewer assumptions under stress. Not because they are wiser, but because they slow down on purpose. That's a skill. Not a personality gift. That week, I started practicing something simple. Before reacting, I waited 3 seconds. Not to be polite. To let my nervous system catch up. 3 seconds is often enough to switch the brain out of alarm mode. The effect was immediate. At home. In conversations. In English practice. I stopped quitting mentally halfway through sentences. I stayed. Judging too fast is rarely about the other person. It's about how safe you feel in uncertainty. When safety is low, speed increases. When safety rises, patience returns. That realization changed how I saw my own struggles. I wasn't failing. I was protecting myself the only way my brain knew how. And protection can be unlearned. You don't fix judgment by shaming yourself. You fix it by slowing the environment. Slower speech. Fewer decisions. Shorter expectations. Softer self-talk. That's why this story matters. Not because a billionaire surprised me, but because a quiet moment reminded me that understanding is a biological process, not a moral one. When you slow down, your brain remembers how to care. And once it remembers, judging feels unnecessary. Learning English like living life. What surprised me most wasn't that my English improved. It was how it improved, quietly, without effort, without the tension I had grown used to. For years, I treated English like a problem to solve. Something external. Something slightly hostile. But that week, English felt less like a test and more like a companion walking beside me. And that changed everything. I noticed that when I stopped forcing myself to sound advanced, my sentences became clearer, shorter, more honest. That's something many adult learners resist. They believe complexity equals intelligence. But research in communication psychology shows the opposite. Clarity builds trust, while unnecessary complexity builds distance. The same is true in relationships. In my marriage, when I tried to sound right instead of being real, conversations stalled. When I simplified, fewer explanations, more listening, things moved again. English didn't need to be impressive. It needed to be usable. That realization lifted a weight I didn't know I was carrying. That week, I practiced speaking out loud in moments that felt safe. Talking to myself while driving. Repeating short phrases after slow audio. Not perfectly. Just present. No shame. No scorekeeping. The brain learns language best in low-stakes environments. This isn't motivational talk, it's neuroscience. Stress blocks the hippocampus, the region responsible for forming new memories. Calm opens it. That's why children learn faster. Not because they're smarter, but because they are less afraid to sound wrong. Adults don't fail at English because they lack ability. They fail because they attach identity to performance. That taxi driver understood this intuitively. He spoke slowly not because he had to, but because speed wasn't necessary. Meaning arrived anyway. And because meaning arrived, connection followed. That's the lesson most courses never teach. You don't need to chase native speed. You don't need to sound impressive. You need to feel safe enough to stay in the conversation. I started noticing how often I escaped conversations when they became uncomfortable, switching topics, changing apps, filling silence. Learning English exposed that habit, because language demands attention. You can't multitask meaning. Living in America magnifies this. The pressure to be efficient is constant. But efficiency is not the same as effectiveness. In learning or in love. That week, I stopped measuring progress in vocabulary size or minutes studied. I measured it in presence. Could I stay with a sentence longer? Could I listen without planning my response? Could I allow confusion without panic? Those small shifts added up. By the end of the week, English felt less intimidating, not because it became easier, but because I became calmer. And calm is the foundation of comprehension. That calm didn't stay confined to learning. It leaked into my marriage, my parenting, my patience. When you train your brain to stay present in one area, it learns to stay present elsewhere. Learning English like living life isn't poetic advice. It's practical survival for adults who are already carrying too much. Slow down the input. Lower the stakes. Stay longer than you're comfortable. That's where fluency begins. A softer way to see people. By the end of that week, nothing in my life looked dramatically different. Same streets. Same coffee shops. Same quiet evenings after the kids went to sleep. My English was still imperfect. My marriage was still a work in progress. My worries hadn't magically disappeared. But something subtle had shifted inside me. I noticed I was slower to react. Slower to judge. Slower to label people as easy or difficult, smart or simple, important or ordinary. And that slowness felt peaceful. When you misjudge someone, it's rarely because you're a bad person. It's usually because your brain is tired. Cognitive psychology calls this mental shortcuts. When the brain is overloaded, it simplifies the world to survive. Appearances become conclusions. First impressions become final decisions. That's exactly what happened to me in that taxi. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't arrogant. I was just mentally rushing. That realization was uncomfortable, but freeing. Because if misjudgment comes from speed, then growth comes from slowing down. I began practicing this consciously. In conversations, I paused 1 extra second before responding. In English, when I didn't understand a word, I didn't panic. I stayed with the emotion of the sentence. Research shows that emotional context activates memory far better than isolated vocabulary. In simple terms, you learn language faster when you care about the story. That's why I stopped treating English like a test, and started treating it like a human experience. At home, this softness changed my marriage in small but real ways. I didn't interrupt as quickly. I asked questions I used to avoid. Not dramatic questions, just honest ones. What do you mean? Can you tell me more? Those 5 English words did more for my relationship than perfect grammar ever could. And with my children, I noticed something beautiful. They don't judge the way adults do. They observe. They wait. They accept contradictions. One moment someone is funny. The next moment they are tired. Children understand complexity naturally, until we teach them to simplify people too early. That billionaire understood something similar. He didn't hide to deceive. He hid to live lightly. To move through the world without the weight of expectation. Without being trapped by a label. We think being seen is power. Sometimes, being unseen is freedom. If you're watching this and feeling discouraged about English, about life, about relationships. Let me say this clearly, you are not failing. You are just moving too fast for depth to catch up. Slow down your listening. Simplify your speaking. Delay your judgments. Language is not built by pressure. It's built by presence. And people. People are never what they seem at first glance. Including you. So next time you meet someone, and your brain rushes to decide who they are, pause. Let the story unfold. You might discover that the most ordinary moment becomes the one that quietly changes you. Before you leave this video, pause for a moment. Think about the last time you judged someone in just a few seconds. Maybe it was someone speaking broken English. Maybe someone dressed very simply. Or maybe it was yourself. That week in the US taught me something uncomfortable, but powerful. What we notice first is usually the least important part of the story. The real meaning always comes later, only if we're patient enough to stay. English works the same way. You don't need to understand every word. You just need to stay with the story long enough for meaning to appear. If I had walked away that day, it would have been just another ordinary taxi ride. But because I stayed, I carried home a lesson that changed how I see marriage, family, and the way I learn English. So here's the question I want to leave with you. How many important stories have you missed because you decided too quickly? If this video made you slow down, even for one breath, please tap like so I know you're here. If you want to practice listening, reading, and speaking English through real, emotional stories, subscribe to the channel, there's more coming. And if you know someone who feels tired, discouraged, or ready to give up, share this video with them. Because maybe this wasn't just a story. Maybe it was an invitation to see people, and yourself, a little more gently. That's all for today. I'll be making more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to watch more.